The oak-paneled debate hall at Harvard University was packed. Rows of students, alumni, professors, and media sat shoulder to shoulder beneath the high, arched ceilings. Chandeliers sparkled overhead. Cameras from national networks were already rolling. The topic for the evening: morality and modern policy, a loaded theme in a divided America. At center stage stood Dr. Marcus Ellery, Harvard's most outspoken liberal voice. Known for his sharp wit and withering commentary, the silver-haired professor had made headlines for calling traditional values remnants of a fading past. Tonight he held a microphone and the attention of an elite crowd. Then the doors opened. Karoline Leavitt, the 27-year-old White House press secretary, stepped into the hall. Her entrance was quiet, but striking. She wore a crisp navy suit, heels that clicked softly on the hardwood, and a simple silver cross around her neck, elegant, personal, and impossible to miss under the lights. It shimmered subtly with each step she took toward her reserved seat at the front. The moment the crowd noticed her, a buzz swept through the room. A few murmurs, some whispers, a few raised eyebrows. But it wasn't her age or position that stirred them. It was that necklace, so visible, so deliberate, so unorthodox in this hall of secular intellect. Dr. Ellery's smile widened as he leaned into the mic. "Well," he said, his voice booming through the chamber, "I didn't expect the White House to send someone wearing a cross instead of credentials." A wave of laughter erupted from the audience, students chuckling, faculty smirking, a few journalists exchanging grins. The jab hit its mark, and Ellery stood tall, clearly pleased with himself. Karoline sat down slowly, her expression unreadable. She adjusted the microphone before her, but said nothing. Instead, she smiled, just faintly, and met Ellery's gaze with a calm so steady it was almost unnerving. The moderator cleared his throat, sensing tension but sticking to the script. "Tonight's discussion," he began, "will explore the question: can personal morality guide national policy in a divided age?" Karoline remained quiet as the moderator outlined the format. But in her silence, something stirred. Not defensiveness, not embarrassment. Something else. The kind of quiet resolve that doesn't shout but waits for the right moment. Across the aisle, a student in a hoodie whispered to his friend, "She's not going to let that slide, is she?" Dr. Ellery continued, effortlessly gliding into his opening argument. He spoke of modern ethics, the evolution of values, and the supposed danger of letting personal faith interfere with public duty. His tone was polished, rehearsed, professorial. He mentioned America's founders, then quickly pivoted to criticize today's administration, accusing it of clinging to sacred texts while ignoring science. At every turn, he made sure to imply that faith had no business in the future of governance. The audience responded well. Heads nodded. Applause followed. Ellery leaned back in his chair, sipping from a tall glass of spring water, clearly satisfied. All eyes turned to Karoline. The moderator announced, "And now remarks from Miss Karoline Leavitt, representing the office of the White House press secretary." She rose slowly, gracefully. For a second, she simply looked around. No script in hand. No teleprompter. Just a calm, steady presence in front of hundreds of eager eyes and at least a dozen cameras. Her hand brushed her cross gently, almost without thinking, as she stepped forward to the podium. She leaned into the mic. "I wasn't aware that faith and credentials were mutually exclusive," she said, her voice cool but clear. The room stilled. "I'm here tonight not because I was chosen to recite party lines or trade insults. I'm here because I believe that morality, real morality, has a place in how we govern. And that belief doesn't come from a briefing memo or a political poll. It comes from something deeper." She paused, letting the silence fill with anticipation. "My cross doesn't diminish my education. It doesn't erase the work I've done, the policies I've helped shape, or the votes I've earned in press rooms across this country. It reminds me of something America used to cherish: conviction. There was no applause yet, no outburst, just a charged stillness. From the back row, a reporter whispered, "She came prepared." Ellery poked the wrong fire. Karoline continued, "You see, Dr. Ellery is right about one thing. Our nation is divided. But he's wrong if he thinks the answer is mocking those who hold on to faith. The real problem isn't belief. It's forgetting how to respect belief." She turned slightly toward Ellery, her gaze direct but not unkind. "I don't wear this cross to make others uncomfortable. I wear it to remind myself every day that politics without purpose is just noise. That policy without heart is just paperwork. That America at her best was never afraid of someone who stood for something." Now the murmurs began to shift. Some heads nodded, older professors, a few students, even members of the media who had entered expecting nothing more than fireworks and sound bites. But something deeper had begun. This wasn't just a debate. This was something else, a reckoning between the old wisdom of the heart and the cold confidence of intellect. And Karoline had just fired her first shot. The silence after Karoline's calm but powerful opening didn't last long. Dr. Marcus Ellery straightened in his chair, his lips tight, the tips of his fingers steepled in front of him. The polished academic who had mocked her necklace now found himself in unfamiliar territory, outmaneuvered by grace under fire. But he wasn't finished. Not yet. With a sharp smile, he leaned toward the microphone. "Miss Leavitt," he began, his tone still smooth but edged with condescension. "Religion is often used as a crutch for those afraid of progress. I don't mean to be cruel," he added, eyes twinkling insincerely, "but it's 2025. We should be making policy with data, not doctrine." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Others remained still, sensing what was coming. Karoline didn't flinch. She merely folded her hands and waited. Ellery pressed on. "Let's be honest," he said, voice rising. "Faith has been used for centuries to justify resistance to change, from banning scientific discoveries to suppressing civil rights. If your faith guides policy, we're in danger of walking backward into the very darkness we've spent decades escaping." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a challenge tossed across a battlefield. Karoline rose slowly, the cross around her neck catching the light again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. But when she spoke, it was like a quiet bell cutting through fog, clear, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore. "Faith doesn't slow progress," she said, locking eyes with Dr. Ellery. "It keeps us from losing our way when progress forgets purpose." The audience stirred, not with applause yet, but with shifting weight, tightening brows, and held breath. Ellery's jaw tightened. Karoline continued, her voice steady. "You call it a crutch, Dr. Ellery. I call it a compass. Science tells us what we can do. Faith asks what we should do. They aren't enemies. They're partners if we let them be." A student near the front leaned forward, eyes wide. Dr. Ellery responded quicker now. "You say it keeps us from losing our way. But whose way? Yours? The church's? The GOP's faith is personal. Policy is public. Blurring the line is dangerous, Miss Leavitt." Karoline nodded slightly. "You're right. Faith is personal. And that's exactly why mocking it publicly is dangerous. Not for me, but for the nation we say we want to unify." A flicker of movement. An older woman in the third row adjusted her pearl necklace, nodding softly. Ellery's voice grew sharper. "You're defending centuries of oppression cloaked in scripture. Tell me, would you defend the same if it weren't your own faith being criticized?" Karoline took a breath, her tone unshaken. "I've never defended oppression, but I will defend the freedom to believe. And I'll stand against the arrogance that says faith has no place in modern minds. That kind of thinking doesn't build bridges, it burns them." The older gentleman behind her in a tweed jacket and bow tie folded his arms and murmured, "She's not wrong." Dr. Ellery leaned forward, his face flushed now. "You stand there representing the White House and speak of morality as if it were exclusive to the religious. What about those of us who find purpose without holy texts? Are we morally inferior?" Karoline's eyes softened. "No. But you just implied I—" A hush fell over the hall. The moderator glanced between them, unsure whether to intervene or let it continue. But something in the room said, "Let it continue." Karoline turned slightly toward the audience now, her voice addressing not just Ellery, but every watching eye. "Look, I'm not here to convert anyone. That's not my role. But I am here to remind us all that America wasn't built by people who were all the same. It was built by people who believed in something bigger than themselves. Some called it liberty. Some called it God. Some called it both. What mattered was the conviction." Ellery scoffed lightly. "Respect must be earned, Miss Leavitt." Karoline nodded again. "Exactly. Which is why I came here to earn yours. Not with anger, not with sound bites, but with honesty." She paused. "And let's be honest. We live in a time where mocking someone's faith gets more applause than understanding it. But that's not progress. That's just polished intolerance." Gasps, whispers, and a few scattered claps. Ellery stood now, sensing control slipping. "You say you respect science," he said, voice firmer. "But you also defend policies that deny climate change, restrict medical rights, and ban books. So forgive me, Miss Leavitt, if I question whether your cross is guiding you or blinding you." Karoline didn't rise to the bait. She let the accusation hang a moment, then replied with precision, "I don't hide from hard questions. But I don't believe that disagreeing on solutions means we're blind. It means we're free. And yes, I applause now, not thunderous, but real." The young man in the back row clapped first, then the woman with the pearl necklace, then a few more. Karoline looked directly at Ellery. "You don't have to agree with me. But if we can't talk about morality, real morality in public life without mockery, then what are we doing here? Policy without soul isn't progress. It's just motion." For a moment, Dr. Ellery had no reply. He looked down, adjusted his notes, and offered only a stiff, "Well said." It wasn't surrender, but it wasn't victory either. It was something else. Karoline turned back to the audience, her voice softening. "We're a nation built on differences. Faith and reason. Tradition and innovation. East and west. Left and right. But if we lose respect, we lose the whole thing." A long silence followed. This time not awkward but thoughtful. The camera lights dimmed slightly as the debate moved to the next speaker, but the energy in the room remained heavy with reflection. Karoline sat down, her hand resting lightly on the cross. She didn't smile. She didn't smirk. She just sat calm, firm, and unchanged. And in that moment, many realized something unexpected. She hadn't come to fight. She'd come to remind them that standing for faith wasn't weakness. It was strength, and it wasn't the past. It was her foundation for the future. The applause had faded, but the tension hadn't. After Karoline's measured defense of faith, Harvard's debate hall settled into a tense rhythm like a symphony inching toward an unexpected crescendo. Lights glinted softly across polished wood, and not a single cough or shuffle broke the focus. The audience had leaned in, not just physically but mentally. Hearts beat a little faster. Thoughts stirred a little deeper. Dr. Marcus Ellery straightened his shoulders and cleared his throat, trying to regain the intellectual ground he felt slipping beneath him. A respected voice in progressive academia, he had long reveled in dismantling tradition, questioning institutions, and above all, discrediting religion as outdated folklore. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't the opponent he'd expected. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't snapped. Yet somehow her calm conviction was more disarming than anger ever could be. He looked toward her, smiled tightly, and delivered his next line with deliberate precision. "Miss Leavitt," he said, "we don't need superstition in science or policy. We need facts, evidence, and data. Not crosses, not creeds." The audience held its breath. Karoline, still seated, didn't blink. Her hand rested lightly on the table, fingertips brushing the engraved silver cross that had started it all. She waited just long enough to let the words settle, then leaned forward slightly. "I believe in data too, Dr. Ellery," she said, her voice low and even, but laced with a quiet fire. "But tell me, what data set tells you why your life matters?" The silence was instant. You could have heard the ticking of a watch, the creak of someone shifting in their seat. Even the distant hum of an air vent seemed suddenly loud in the stillness that followed her question. Dr. Ellery opened his mouth but said nothing. And in that breathless pause, something subtle shifted in the room. A young man, in a Harvard sweatshirt, at the back of the auditorium, leaned forward, eyebrows raised. A woman in her 60s, near the front, rested her fingers lightly on the gold cross around her neck. A professor 2 rows back, who had nodded at every one of Ellery's jabs until now, folded his arms, suddenly thoughtful. Karoline didn't press. She let the silence speak. And it did. Finally, Dr. Ellery offered a dry chuckle, more reflex than rebuttal. "Purpose," he said slowly, "is a personal journey. We don't need religion to define it." "Agreed." Karoline nodded gently. "But you just dismissed faith as superstition. So let me ask again, if we are nothing more than chemical patterns and evolutionary accidents, where does purpose come from? Why does justice matter? Why do human rights matter? Why do you matter?" The words hit, not like an attack, but like a mirror held up. And it was clear in that moment, the audience wasn't hearing a press secretary defend her talking points. They were watching a young woman half the room's age ask the most ancient question of all. "Why are we here?" Dr. Ellery shifted in his seat. "Well," he said, his voice more cautious, "now we find meaning through reason, through connection, through social constructs, through each other." Karoline nodded slowly. "And that's beautiful. But what happens when those constructs break down? What anchors you when the crowd turns on you? When truth isn't popular? Or when you're alone? Truly alone?" There it was again, that hush, an emotional stillness that overtook intellectual noise. Karoline's gaze swept the room, not triumphantly, not to boast, but to connect, to make sure the question landed not just with Dr. Ellery, but with everyone present. "I've read the data," she continued. "I've seen the algorithms. I've studied political theory, historical trends, and economic curves. But when my mother was diagnosed with cancer, I didn't turn to a spreadsheet. I turned to prayer. When I held my newborn son for the first time, I didn't quote a journal. I whispered, 'Thank you, Lord.'" She paused. "And when I walk into rooms like this, rooms that laugh at faith, I don't feel small. Because I know who I am. And I know why I am." That word "why" hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. A ripple moved through the audience. Quiet. Reflective. Not everyone agreed. But for the first time they felt her words. Not just heard them. Dr. Ellery looked away, then back. "I'm not saying people don't find strength in belief," he said, now more tentative. "But public policy science should be rooted in what we can prove, not what we feel." Karoline leaned in, not to dominate, but to clarify. "I don't make policy based on feelings," she said. "I make it with facts. But values still matter. And if we erase the soul from our system, we're not building progress. We're building a machine." A student near the back whispered to her neighbor, "That's..." Actually, a good point. And in that moment, something unexpected happened. The debate stopped feeling like a fight. It started feeling like a reckoning. With history, with assumptions, with self. Karoline sat back, letting her words breathe. "I'm not afraid of science," she added. "I'm afraid of a world that worships it without asking why it exists. I'm afraid of a future that runs faster than it thinks. And most of all, I'm afraid of a culture that mocks what gives people meaning just because it can't be measured." Then she did something simple, but powerful. She took off the cross, held it in her hand, and said, "This isn't a weapon. It's not a campaign tool. It's a reminder that even in rooms where I'm not welcomed, I have worth. And so does every person who wears a symbol that says, 'I believe.'" No applause, just stillness. Then the moderator, his voice unusually soft, broke in. "We'll move to closing remarks soon," he said, glancing between them. "But I think we've heard something deeper tonight than either side expected." Karoline turned to Ellery one last time. "You don't have to believe what I believe," she said. "But I ask you don't call faith a superstition, because for many of us it's the reason we get back up when life knocks us down." And for the first time since the debate began, Dr. Ellery said nothing at all. He just looked at the young woman across from him and blinked. The crowd remained silent, thinking, wrestling, reflecting. Because Karoline Leavitt hadn't just won a debate. She had awakened a question. And it was a question no data set could answer. The room still hadn't recovered from Karoline's last question. The air in the Harvard debate hall, once filled with the hum of intellectual tension, now hung heavy with silence, a silence of reflection, of discomfort, of unexpected awe. Dr. Marcus Ellery sat visibly rattled behind his polished mahogany podium. He tapped his index finger against his water glass, searching for a line that could pull the spotlight back to his corner. But for once in his career of public intellectual showdowns, nothing came. And that silence, that breathless pause, only amplified Karoline Leavitt's impact. Then in the stillness, a ripple. From the second row, a student in a maroon Harvard sweatshirt approached the stage steps cautiously. He was no heckler. In fact, his expression was oddly serious, respectful even. He leaned in toward Karoline, whispering something just loud enough for only her to hear. She listened, blinked once, then nodded softly. "Excuse me," she said, turning slightly toward the moderator. "I need 30 seconds. The moderator, still visibly impacted by the earlier exchange, gave a puzzled nod. "Of course," he said, motioning for the mic to be temporarily silenced. Karoline reached into her navy blazer and pulled out her phone. A number flashed across the screen. "Private. White House line 1. Her thumb hesitated for half a breath before tapping accept. She didn't rise. She didn't boast. She simply stood and turned slightly, placing a hand to her ear. "Mr. President," she said quietly, her voice still audible to those nearby. The moment the words left her lips, the entire hall shifted. A rustle, a gasp, then a wave of murmurs sweeping through the audience like a gust through a wheat field. Even Dr. Ellery froze. President Trump. Now Karoline's tone was calm but clear. "Yes, sir. I'm at Harvard now. The debate just reached a critical point." She paused, listening intently, nodding once or twice, then, without raising her voice, uttered a phrase that would later circulate across cable news and social media like wildfire. "Yes, sir. I'll make the announcement tonight. It's the right moment." With that, she ended the call, turned back toward the microphone, and looked across the audience with composed authority. "I'd like to share something I hadn't planned to tonight," she began. Another hush fell. She raised her phone for a moment, letting the presidential seal flash on the lock screen before sliding it back into her pocket. "I just got off a call with President Trump," she said without theatrics. and he's just given me clearance to announce a new White House initiative, one that I've helped shape over the past year." She paused, her gaze steady. "Starting next month, the Trump administration will be launching a nationwide religious freedom in education initiative. Its goal is to ensure that no student in any public or private American institution, whether wearing a cross, a yarmulke, or a hijab, is ever mocked, shamed, or penalized for what they believe." A collective exhale rippled through the room. Some in the crowd leaned forward. Others exchanged surprised glances. And, somewhere from the back, a soft but unmistakable clap began. It spread, slowly, hesitantly, then built row by row. Even a few professors began to applaud. Karoline didn't smile. She didn't revel in the moment. She merely let the impact settle as she continued. "This isn't a partisan initiative," she said. "It's a human one. Because while debates like this one matter deeply, what matters more is ensuring that the next generation of students on campuses like this one don't feel the need to hide their convictions just to fit into a modern narrative." Dr. Ellery sat stiffly, lips parted ever so slightly. The color had drained from his face. He wasn't humiliated, but he was shaken. And not because of a personal attack. No, this was different. He realized in that moment that the young woman he had mocked for her cross didn't just hold convictions. She held power, real power, the kind that changes policy, the kind that rewrites headlines, the kind that speaks softly but echoes nationally. Religious freedom, Karoline continued, isn't just about what we believe. It's about protecting the right to believe or not believe without ridicule or fear. And if institutions like Harvard can't defend that freedom, then we're not educating leaders. We're producing cynics. The applause now surged louder. From the balcony, a voice called out, "God bless you." Karoline glanced upward and nodded, not with ego, but with gratitude. "This isn't about Trump," she said. "It's not even about me. It's about the students across this country, rural, urban, conservative, liberal, who wonder if they still belong in the America we're becoming. Tonight I say, yes, you do." She stepped back from the mic, her voice done, but her message ringing clear. And then something no one expected. Dr. Marcus Ellery stood. He didn't speak. He didn't clap. But for the first time all evening, he looked at her not with contempt, but with something closer to humility. He gave her a nod. It was brief, subtle, but deeply telling. Karoline met his eyes and returned the gesture. In that moment, something bigger than debate happened. It wasn't a victory. It was a shift, a soft turning of the tide. In the audience, a journalism student recorded the scene on her phone. That clip would hit 5.2 million views in 48 hours. Hashtags like #faith at Harvard and #Karoline stands would trend nationally by morning. But Karoline didn't care about virality. As she exited the stage, the silver cross on her neck gleaming once more, she whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." And somewhere far above the campus, in a quiet West Wing room, a president smiled and said, "Well done." The clapping had died down. The crowd, moments ago ablaze with reaction to Karoline Leavitt's announcement, now settled into a deeper kind of stillness. Not the stunned hush of controversy, but a thoughtful, heavy pause. A quiet that carried weight. Dr. Marcus Ellery sat rigid in his seat. The man who had opened the debate with barbed wit and cool disdain now stared down at his notes, but he wasn't reading them. His pen, which had moments earlier clicked with theatrical impatience, now rested silently on the desk beside his untouched glass of water. It was more than Karoline's poise that disarmed him, more than her command of words, or even her presidential backing. It was the substance of what she brought. He had expected rhetoric. She brought reality. He had expected dogma. She delivered dignity. He had dismissed the cross around her neck as ornamentation, but now he understood it was testimony. And then it happened. From the third row, a voice broke the silence, not loud but piercing in its sincerity. "I'm not religious," the young woman began. She stood slowly, visibly nervous, clutching a notebook to her chest. "But maybe that's why I feel so empty sometimes." All eyes turned toward her. Her name, as Karoline would later learn, was Lana Rivers, a sophomore majoring in political science, a scholarship student, first in her family to attend college. She stood alone in a sea of seated classmates and professors, her voice trembling just enough to betray the emotional weight behind her words. "I came here tonight to hear a debate," she continued, glancing between Dr. Ellery and Karoline. "I thought I knew where I stood. I always thought people who wore their faith so openly were just putting on a show, maybe even avoiding hard truths." Her eyes flicked to Karoline, but not with judgment, with wonder. "But then you said something that really stuck with me about faith not being a crutch, but a compass." She swallowed hard. "And I realized I don't have one. Not a compass. Not a reason. I've spent so much time trying to prove I don't need anything, that I never stopped to ask what I actually stand for." The room was silent. You could have heard a paperclip drop on the carpeted floor. Even Dr. Ellery leaned back slightly, his posture no longer defensive but contemplative. His hand covered his mouth, not out of frustration, but out of something closer to reverence. Karoline looked at Lana with the soft, steady gaze of someone who knew what it meant to question, to wrestle, to feel unmoored. She didn't speak. She didn't rush in with answers. She simply listened. "I'm not saying I believe now," Lana added quickly, "but I am saying maybe belief isn't the weakness I thought it was." She sat back down slowly, her head bowed just slightly, perhaps in embarrassment, or perhaps in thought. The moment was electric, not because it was loud, but because it was real. No rebuttal, no counterpoint, just raw, unpolished truth. Karoline finally stepped toward the microphone again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't call for applause. Instead, she let the moment guide her. "Thank you, Lana," she said, her tone warmer now, less like a debater and more like a mentor. "You don't have to believe in God to recognize that you're more than data, more than GPA scores or political stances. We're all searching for meaning in different ways. But sometimes the loudest question isn't, 'What do you know?' It's, 'Why do you matter?'" She paused, letting those words settle into the room like dust from a long, sealed attic door swinging open. "And if we create a world where we can't even ask that question, we'll lose more than faith. We'll lose each other." Somewhere near the back, someone quietly wiped their eyes. A few students lowered their heads, moved but unsure how to express it. Dr. Ellery finally stirred. His voice, when it came, was lower, measured. "I teach philosophy," he began slowly. "I've lectured on Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell, Sartre. I've argued for reason as the pinnacle of progress." He looked directly at Karoline. "But tonight, I was reminded of something I forgot." He let that hang. His eyes flicked to Lana. "I forgot that in our chase for reason, we sometimes leave behind the very heart that makes reason matter." It wasn't an apology, but it was something close. The moderator, a seasoned professor with graying temples and a career full of tense debates, stood and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice cracking slightly, "I think this night has given us more than a debate. It's given us a mirror." The audience rose, not in a standing ovation, but in solemn unity. There was no need for thunderous clapping. The respect was in the stillness, in the understanding that something had shifted not just in the room, but in the way they would carry these questions forward. Karoline stepped down from the podium. As she passed Lana's row, she placed a small card in the young woman's hand. On it, in clean script, were just 5 words. Truth without love is hollow. Lana looked at the card, then up at Karoline, her eyes brimming but determined. Outside the auditorium, the wind was crisp. A few autumn leaves danced along the cobblestone walkway. Karoline paused beneath one of Harvard's iconic gas-lit lamps, letting the moment settle into her bones. Her phone buzzed again. A message from the White House advisor team. Your clip hit 3.4 million views already. Fox wants you on Tucker's show tomorrow. She smiled faintly but didn't reply. Instead, she looked up at the vast sky above Cambridge, her fingers grazing the cross around her neck not as armor but as memory. Because tonight hadn't been about the audience or the applause. It had been about a single student who stood up, confessed her emptiness, and reminded everyone that no policy, no philosophy, no debate ever mattered more than truth spoken from the soul. And that for Karoline Leavitt was worth more than any viral moment. It was the reason she wore that cross. Not for the spotlight, but for nights like this. The auditorium was almost empty now. The spotlights dimmed. The stage quiet. Only a few scattered students lingered, gathering notebooks and whispering softly, still stunned by what had just unfolded. Karoline stood near the edge of the stage, speaking quietly with a professor about the policy proposal she had announced earlier. Her voice, though calm, still carried the clarity of conviction. The silver cross at her neck glinted faintly beneath the overhead light, now more a symbol of grace than defiance. Dr. Marcus Ellery remained seated at the long debate table. His shoulders no longer squared in pride, his chin no longer lifted in disdain. He stared down at his own handwritten notes, so meticulously crafted, now scattered and meaningless in the wake of what he'd witnessed. He had mocked her faith. He had dismissed her cross as a political costume. But it wasn't the president's call or even the thunderous silence that followed her speech that undid him. It was that girl, Lana. It was her confession. That a life without direction, even packed with credentials and opportunity, could still feel empty. And it was Karoline's response. Measured, compassionate, never defensive, never vindictive, just true. After a moment of stillness that felt heavier than applause, Dr. Ellery stood, slowly, as if gravity itself now demanded more of him. He stepped off the stage, his polished Oxford shoes clicking against the aged wood floors, and approached Karoline with the weight of a man who'd just walked through something, not a debate, but a reckoning. She turned to face him as he neared, her expression unreadable, neither smug nor condescending, but open, curious. For the first time that night, his voice held no performance. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone measured but different. "I owe you something. Not a rebuttal, a confession." Karoline remained silent, letting him speak. "I mocked you," he said, glancing around at the fading echoes of the night. "Because I feared what I couldn't control, conviction. That calm resolve you have. It shook me. Because it reminded me of something I once had. Or maybe something I never had the courage to find." The words didn't come easily. He cleared his throat. "You see, I spent my life sharpening logic, chasing tenure, mastering arguments. But when Lana stood up and said she felt empty, I didn't know how to respond. Because deep down, I understood her." Karoline's eyes softened. Still, she didn't speak. "I've debated ministers, authors, senators," Ellery continued. "I've dismantled arguments about God, morality, and meaning for decades. But I never stopped to wonder what that left me with. What I stood for, besides being right." He looked down at his hands. The hands that had pointed, gestured, written volumes of criticism. But tonight he said quietly, "You didn't argue. You witnessed." And that his voice cracked slightly. "That's what made all my cleverness feel small." Karoline slowly reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and pulled out a small, cream-colored card. She held it out to him. Ellery took it gently like a man receiving something far more valuable than paper. On the back, in neat, looping script, were just a few words. Love your enemies. Not because they deserve it, but because it frees you. The quote struck him like a breeze in winter, gentle but chilling. He read it again, then again. Karoline finally spoke, her voice quiet. I don't carry those cards for politics. I carry them for people. Ellery looked at her, emotion flickering in his eyes. You believe it, don't you? He asked, half whispering. Even after tonight I do, she nodded. Because faith isn't about winning arguments. It's about not becoming bitter while standing for something. For a man used to applause and publication, this silence, the one that filled his heart now, was different. It wasn't public approval. It was internal honesty. And that was something new. I never thought I'd say this, he admitted, but thank you. Karoline gave a faint smile. Not victorious, grateful. Ellery tucked the card into his breast pocket over his heart. His voice was quieter now, stripped of sarcasm, stripped of armor. I spent a lifetime trying to appear strong, he said. But tonight a young woman in a blazer and a cross showed me what actual strength looks like. Karoline nodded slowly. Strength, she said, is standing quietly in a storm and refusing to let it change who you are. He paused, letting that settle. I've spent my life teaching students how to question everything, he said. But tonight I realized maybe they need someone to show them how to believe in something too. That line hung between them. Then from behind them the old auditorium doors creaked open as janitors began their sweep. Time to leave. But neither of them moved. You've changed the conversation tonight, Ellery said quietly. Karoline tilted her head. I didn't change it. Truth did. I just chose not to be ashamed of it. Ellery looked around once more, then offered his hand. A gesture not of surrender, but of respect. She took it. They shook hands, not as opponents, but as human beings who had stood on opposite ends of an invisible chasm, and finally found a bridge. As he turned to leave, he glanced back one last time. That card, he said, tapping his jacket pocket. I'm going to keep it. Karoline smiled. I hope you do. Outside, the air was cold now. The brick walls of Harvard's iconic halls stood tall beneath the autumn moonlight. As students filed out quietly, some whispering about the debate, others silent in thought, Lana Rivers walked alone toward the Charles River. She pulled out her phone and stared at the photo she'd taken of Karoline's quote projected on the auditorium screen. She didn't quite know what it meant yet, but she knew one thing for sure. She'd never forget that night. And neither would America. Because long after the lights had dimmed and the microphones were packed away, the echo of conviction still stirred something deep, something sacred in every person who had been there. For a few seconds, the room stood still. Dr. Marcus Ellery didn't respond right away. He didn't argue. He didn't offer one final clever remark to reclaim dignity. Instead, his hand moved slowly to the cream-colored card Karoline Leavitt had just given him, his fingers tracing the handwritten words, "Love your enemies." Not because they deserve it, but because it frees you. Without a word, he folded the card carefully like it was something fragile and slipped it into the front pocket of his tweed blazer, resting just over his heart. The silence in the auditorium didn't last. A single clap echoed, then another, and within moments the entire auditorium rose to its feet, not with thunderous applause, but with a sustained, steady ovation that seemed less about victory and more about reverence. They weren't clapping because Karoline had won the debate. They were clapping because she hadn't tried to. She didn't humiliate her opponent. She didn't gloat. She stood with humility, with grace, and with a conviction so rare in modern political discourse that it pierced through the noise like a clear bell on a cold morning. Karoline nodded quietly, her silver cross catching the warm stage light one final time as she stepped down from the platform. Her heels clicked softly against the hardwood floor as she passed Dr. Ellery, who remained still, head lowered, card resting close to his chest, as if guarding something too personal to explain. As she reached the edge of the stage, Lana Rivers, the student who had spoken so vulnerably earlier, stood waiting, eyes wide, her expression unreadable. Karoline leaned in gently, and with a voice barely above a whisper said, "The world doesn't change through arguments. It changes when hearts soften." Lana's breath caught slightly and she nodded, eyes shimmering. That simple sentence planted something in her that no textbook ever had. She wouldn't forget it. Not now. Not in 50 years. Outside, the cool autumn breeze rustled the amber leaves along Harvard Yard. The bell from Memorial Church chimed the hour. The sky had shifted to deep twilight, the horizon casting a golden hue over the red brick buildings. As Karoline walked quietly beneath the old elm trees lining the cobblestone path, her phone buzzed. It was a message from the White House Chief of Staff. President saw the live stream. Says that's what conviction looks like. Let's move forward with the initiative. She paused, reading it twice, then smiled faintly, not in triumph, but in deep affirmation. The new federal proposal designed to protect religious freedom on university campuses would move to committee in just a week. But policy wasn't what she was thinking about right now. She was thinking about Lana, about the older woman in the third row who had clutched her own necklace when Karoline defended her cross. About Dr. Ellery, who folded a card instead of making a final jab. She was thinking about how change never begins in law books, but in quiet corners of the human heart. 2 weeks later, Karoline stood at the White House South Lawn overlooking the gardens, a crisp folder tucked beneath her arm. Inside were signed documents, the official launch of the Faith in Education initiative designed not to promote any single religion, but to protect the right of every student, faculty member, or speaker to express their beliefs without ridicule or reprisal. Across from her stood a reporter from the Washington Sentinel, microphone in hand, skepticism in his brow. "Ms. Leavitt, how do you respond to critics who say this initiative blurs the line between church and state?" Karoline didn't blink. "It doesn't blur the line," she said. "It protects the people walking it. We're not legislating belief. We're making sure faith isn't treated as a flaw in our institutions." He lowered the mic, surprised at the clarity. "And if you're wondering," she added with a soft smile, "yes, I still wear the cross. And no, I don't wear it for applause." That evening the story aired nationwide. But it wasn't the press that moved the country. It was the reactions from Americans watching at home. In Indiana, a retired teacher named Evelyn wrote to her local paper, "I was raised to believe my faith mattered." Seeing a young woman say it out loud again brought tears to my eyes. In Ohio, a Vietnam veteran left a voicemail for the White House switchboard. "Tell Karoline, thank you. I haven't stepped foot in a church since the war. But tonight, I thought about it." In California, Dr. Ellery posted a short message on his faculty blog, his first in over a year. "I once said religion was outdated. But after Harvard's debate, I believe conviction, humility, and moral grounding are not only relevant, they're necessary. I was wrong, and I'm grateful to have learned it." Back in D.C., weeks later, Karoline sat at her desk after hours reviewing the final edits on a speech she was preparing for a university summit. The card she'd once given to Dr. Ellery sat on the edge of her desk, now not because it had been returned, but because he had sent her one of his own in reply. The handwriting was careful. "Conviction isn't stubbornness. It's clarity without cruelty. Thank you for yours." She placed it in a drawer beside a small photo of her son, just 7 years old, grinning with 2 missing teeth. She touched the cross around her neck. Not as a politician, not as a press secretary, but as a mother, a daughter, an American. Someone who still believed that the soul of a nation was not built in courtroom rulings or shouting matches, but in the quiet strength to live by truth, even when it costs you. That night, as the lights of Washington twinkled across the Potomac, Karoline Leavitt walked slowly out of the West Wing. Her footsteps echoed along the marble halls, steady, certain. Behind her, policy had been written. Ahead of her, young Americans were thinking, and somewhere in between, a quiet revolution had begun. If you enjoyed this story of courage, clarity, and conviction, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because sometimes it only takes one moment of grace to soften a heart and shift a nation.